Hello students, welcome to class. Today we're going to talk about masculinity, gender, conformity and nonconformity, and visibility. Today's discussion questions, there are 10, include sociological terms that we will be incorporating into the lecture. The first one is, how does Coco Lane's project challenge traditional notions of gender and its role in everyday interactions, meaning gender norms? We know that Judith Butler's concept of performativity suggests that gender is a performance rather than an inherent trait. It's what Lisa Wade calls doing gender. It's the action of how we perform our gendered roles and expectations. How is gender a social construct, which is also a sociological concept? And how might this idea influence how we understand gendered norms in our society? Number 3 is, how does Coco's struggle with femme visibility within genderqueer community highlight the tensions between personal identity and societal expectations? Basically the micro and the macro. And how is she and other people being policed in regards to their gender identity? What are the implications of workplaces rewarding specific gender performances? As highlighted in the research on trans men and Coco's own experiences. Essentially, how are they gender policed? How might legal cases like Jasperin and Harris shape macro level societal attitudes? Policies, laws, and policies and laws towards gender expression and professional settings. In what ways does Coco's art project Warpaint reveal the theory of intersectionality, which is the connection between gender, in this case, gender, sexuality, and societal norms? Number 7, to what extent does the concept of visibility impact the lived experiences of queer individuals, particularly in the context of conformity? How might this be socially and economically advantageous? Does Warpaint offer an account for breaking the gendered rules? And how do individuals more commonly simultaneously break and affirm the rules to explore their own gender identities? And how are people with higher social statuses policed differently? Okay, so normally I don't share things like side notes. I try to keep these videos like super, like dense and like just the information so that they stay as short as possible, because I know like you guys don't want to be listening to a lot like anything like side note, but I have to share this. I just finished doing this lecture. I did a great job. I was like, oh, that went really well. And then I looked up and I was not recording the entire time. I did the entire lecture without recording. I can't tell you like how much work these videos actually are. Like a 20-minute video takes about 3 hours to make. So I'm like super upset now. But round 2, let's give it a shot, okay? So we're going to talk about how the article, of course, right? It's a 5-page article, but also talk about how what Coco and the author are talking about has to do with the sociological concepts that we learn. So we're going to talk about things like gender norms, gendered conformity and nonconformity, the concept of doing gender, like this whole series of articles has a lot to do with doing gender, and what she calls gender performativity, and what that has to do with visibility, whether that's in the dominant culture or subculture like the queer community. Being culturally intelligible, what she calls culturally decipherable, what it means to be cisgender and queer, and how that might not be culturally intelligible because of the changing expectations, and what types of social sanctions, positive and negative, come with like your presentation of your gender identity. So let's talk about some of that. So what's this article about? This is Coco Lane, so you could see her up here on the right-hand side. She did an art project called War Paint, and her art project was an exploration of her gender identity, her gender nonconformity, and the type of gendered policing that she felt or experienced, both from the dominant community and from the queer community. She doesn't call it gender policing because she's not a sociologist, so she wouldn't use that terminology. She's saying it's like a critical commentary on what doing gender is and where it comes from, how flexible it is, and what that flexibility means, right? And it's really a great example of the concept Lisa Wade calls the personal exception theory of gender, which is the idea that you know that while there's a gender binary and you can put other people readily into that binary. Oh, all these people are masculine, all these people are feminine, and that's how they present. You know you're not that. You know that your own gender identity is more nuanced than that, that it has more complexity than that, right? So so it is really an exploration and an example of the personal exception theory of gender. And then she, connects it to her sexuality. So what gender conformity or gender nonconformity has to do with being accepted within the dominant culture and the queer communities and your connection to your own sexuality. We do know that gender is socially constructed. When something's socially constructed, we can identify it as socially constructed because that concept created by people within society, like gender norms, right, or gender identity, essentially changes over time. It changes by place, by culture, by subculture, and it doesn't have to be inherently real to be real in its consequences. So the example everybody uses of a social construction is money, right? So you know that historically money has not always been what it is today. Not all money is American dollar value money, right? So you go to another country, money changes, right? It is something that we agree is real, right, and has value, and therefore it has value. It doesn't have inherent value. Like food has inherent value, but money doesn't have inherent value. So we know that money is a social construction. It changes over time, changes by place, and it doesn't have to be real in its consequences. So we know gender is the same. Our expression of how people perceive us to be on the masculine side or the feminine side, based on what sex they perceive us to be, is an expression of gender. So gender is what I put on other people. I perceive people's gender. Gender identity is how I experience my own connection to my masculine and feminine traits, right? That's my gender identity. We know gender is socially constructed. It's not biologically determined, despite what they call folk theory suggest, right? So what Coco does is she uses her haircut to explore and redefine her own gender. She's exploring her own gender identity, something that's actually not very uncommon. Most people do this generally as teenagers or in their early 20s. And what she does and she talks about in this art project is how her subtle restyling of her hair and her haircut and her makeup and her clothes can really change her gender. And she's using this expression and exploration as an artistic exploration. She explores, it says, from the article, she explores the way in which the subtle changes in hairstyle, makeup, and clothing cause dramatic transformations in how others perceive her. Because gender is how others perceive you, right? Your gender identity is how you perceive yourself. So Coco's work provides important lessons about how gender is produced just below the radar of most people most of the time. And that's because of what Lisa Wade calls the gender binary glasses, right? So we are extremely culturally competent in identifying gender and the nuances of it because we have what Lisa Wade calls gender binary glasses. And that is a lens that you use to identify people, objects, animals as masculine or feminine. And my favorite example to use is my dog. my dogs. I've had multiple Great Danes. They've always been black, solid, almost solid black Great Danes. They've always been quite large, 150 pounds or more. Some of them have been male, some of them have been female. But everybody I encounter says, "Oh, he is so big. That is such a big dog. That's such a tough looking dog. That's a great dog," right? They always attribute the masculine, even if my dog is feminine and even quite acts. I had, my most recent female dog. She was very old, Great Dane, and she acted quite feminine. She very much acted like a grandma, right? Um, and people always just assumed she was male because she was big. And so that has to do with our cultural lens, right? So we pick up on these just very subtle nuances and we determine them to be masculine or feminine, whether we're looking at an animal, right? So we might say dogs are more masculine than cats. Great Danes are more masculine than poodles or Shih Tzus. Motorcycles are more masculine than mopeds. And so we are constantly picking up on things, and that's because we're very, very good at it. We're very culturally competent at that, right? And she basically provides a lesson in that, how we're doing that all of the time, right? And so I would ask you to, think about what assumptions do you carry about gender roles in your everyday lives? And how does that inform how you perceive others? Because you make an assumption about what somebody's sex is based on their gendered presentation, and then you treat them based on with a whole set of assumptions based on that assumption that you make. And so I would ask you to, take a moment in your everyday life and try to start to think about what you're doing and how you're perceiving other people and what kind of assumptions you might be carrying through and how that might be affecting how you behave. You can't say that you don't do it. We all do it. It's part of the way we navigate our lives. We have to do it, right? To say that you don't do it is to be biased and unaware, right? So to be aware is to reduce that bias and to be more in tune with how you might perceive other things, even if it includes something you might think is a bias. So, what Butler says is gender performativity. What Lisa Wade says is doing gender. Excuse me. It's the idea that gender is so doing gender or gender performativity is the act of acting out those behaviors, right? The idea that gender is not innate but enacted through repeated behaviors. The everyday repeated behaviors that we do, the things that we carry, not just the way we dress, the domestic labor that you do, the job that you choose, the hobbies that you have, the friends that you make, right? Those are all a performance of gender, what Lisa Wade calls doing gender. The way you sit, the way you talk, the way you move your hands, everything is always gendered performativity. And we're reproducing that constantly over time, which creates for us our gender norms. And those gender norms are then reflected back on us because those are society's expectations of gender performativity. And we tend to learn those through socialization and then internalize them. Generally, when we're pretty young, right? We start learning gendered behaviors from the minute that we're born. We hold baby boys differently than girls. We give boys and girls different toys. We talk to them differently. We talk about them differently. And all of those things are the way that we socialize our children into the masculine or the feminine gendered identity. And we're very good at it, right? What is called cultural competence, right? And when we don't do that, usually on purpose, Butler argues that that's called abjection. It's about failing to perform gender in a culturally recognizable way. So breaking the rules isn't failing to perform gender. breaking the rules is just breaking the rules. You can break the rules, and that might actually, you might be breaking the dominant rules, but conforming to a subgroup's rules, right? A subculture's rules, right? But when you fail to do the rules in a way that is culturally recognizable to either put you into the dominant group or into like a subculture group, like maybe like the goth culture or punk culture, right? The dominant group will still recognize what you're doing. They just also recognize that you're doing it in a culturally intelligible way for a subgroup, right? But when you don't do that, and you're not culturally decipherable, you're subject to all sorts of social sanctions, mostly negative sanctions, not just from the dominant group, but also often from peers, family, friends, other subcultures, right? So the article here gives us a few examples of social sanctions for not doing gender in a socially recognizable way, whether that's from the economy, that's from law, that could be from a subculture, right? So how do you think our society might enforce or punish us, right? Give us negative and positive sanctions for our gender performances. Can you think of a few examples of that? So when a teacher lectures, little side note, right? When a teacher lectures and then you think of examples in your head, you are doing like the second and third cognitive level. You're learning, you're helping yourself to remember, you're also helping yourself to understand. It's something called active listening, and it's a great thing to do when you're listening to a lecture, is to give yourself examples. You're going to help yourself learn the information, remember the information, and be able to decipher that information into more complex steps later on. So, what we see is that within the subgroups, one of the positive sanctions for Coco was that, I'm sorry, in the dominant group, one of the positive sanctions for Coco was that her femme presentation gets her jobs, right? It's easier to get a job, to be part of the economy when you fit into the social norms, the cisgendered presentation of social norm, right? But it also had a negative sanction for her in that it impeded her ability to be recognized within the queer community, which is a subculture that she wanted to be recognized into because of her sexual identity, right? Now, to be cisgendered means that your sex, your body, and your gender identity match. It doesn't have to do with your sexuality. So you can be queer and cisgendered, but we don't recognize it or see it as often. We make the assumption, one, that somebody who's cisgendered is straight, right? We automatically place them in that community. And then if you're not cisgendered, if you represent different than your body, in terms of your gender, we make assumptions that you're part of the queer community. That is also not necessarily the case, right? And she says this here: I struggle with femme visibility and find it a little challenging to have the queer community recognize me to be as queer as they are because of how femme I look sometimes, right? So thinking about this in terms of sociological language, right? How would you interpret her exploration of femme visibility within the queer community? How would you describe this? How would you talk about this? How would you explain this to someone else if you had to teach it to them? And how do you think that communities navigate their own internal biases regarding identity and appearances? So what types of positive and negative sanctions might appear within those communities as well? So what tends to happen, both within like subcultures like the queer community or within dominant cultures, especially on the macro level, is that we tend to see a lot of gendered policing, right? So two examples emerge in the article. One was workplace dynamics and gendered expectation, and the other one was the legal context. So the legal consequences of gendered expression in employment law. And Coco says that, she had a positive sanction. Securing a job was easy for her because she could present cisgendered, right? And Christine Schultz did a research study, and she found that trans men who presented cisgendered, so they present masculine or more masculine, and people perceive them to be male bodied, but they also present masculine, right? Found much more acceptance within the workplace, right? So what we find is that research indicates that workplaces reward and punish people when their particular gendered appearance and practices don't align with the dominant gender binary norms, right? So this is a form of gendered policing. Can you think of how you would explain how this is a form of gendered policing? We also have another macro level example, and that's the legal context, right? So Jaspern versus Harris was a legal finding that found that gendered grooming requirements in the workplace could say that women were required to wear makeup while men were not, right? So this is a different policy or requirement upheld by law that says we could have differing expectations and policies for women versus men. We also know, like, for example, in the media, one of the reasons why you tend to see younger, more, sexually feminine presenting women is because that's a positive attribute. And as women age, as they get older, they're pushed out of the media, whether that is as an actor or news anchors. There was a case with a news anchor, and she let her hair go gray and she was fired, right? But her male colleagues had gray hair. While men get older and get gray hair and their workplaces, allow them to do so, because masculinity, it also coincides with the idea of you can be older and more distinguished as a gentleman, you'll be more knowledgeable, you are more of an authority figure. But women, as they age, don't have that same privilege, and therefore what happens is as they age, they... Hi. My son coming home. I'm not stopping this video. It's on blur in the background though. So we were talking about, as women as they age, if they get gray hair, if they look older, they don't look like more of a authority figure, even if they have a lot more experience. And they aren't seen as more knowledgeable or more as a leader. It's quite the opposite. They're seen as less than, right? And so because of that, and because of laws that lack protection for gender conformity, we can see that disparate consequence on the macro level, legal level, and also in the economic level, right? We see that women aren't able to enter into certain fields and be successful and gain, and continue to rise in authority or in financial, like making more money and, and going up the ladder as they age, because the gender norms with the legal practices have severe implications for people based on their sex and their race and their class and their age as well. And so, and so what that brings us to is something that is called intersectionality. It's a theory, so not necessarily, described in the article, right? But it's definitely touched upon, because this article really is about how gender identity and sexuality intertwine or overlap to create this type of disparate experience for Coco, right? So intersectionality is a theory about, race, class, gender, sex, age, able-bodiedness, and how all of those overlapping identities shape our individual experiences, how they change over time, how they're influenced by macro level forces, institutions like religion and the economy and the media, right? But also how they shape our everyday interactions. That being said, a practical way to put it is the experience for a poor black woman is not going to be the same experience that a poor black man has, right? Or the same experience that a wealthy Asian female has with society and its institutions is not going to be the same experience as a middle class white woman is going to have who happens to be queer, right? So all of those overlapping identities shape our experiences, shape the way that we interact with institutions, with people, how people perceive us, right? How society treats us over time, right? So this idea comes up with Coco in that she's talking about it's the intersection of gender and her sexuality that shapes not just her identity, but highlights the fact that sexuality is not biologically programming our gender identity, right? Our sexuality isn't like something that's injected into us and then, you know, emerges a gender identity. That's not how it works. Things like sex and gender and sexuality are biological, but also very much shaped by our socialization, the time and the place and the culture in which we live. And because of that, our identities are also shaped by all of those things. So Coco says her exploration of her gendered identity is an artistic expression. But Lisa Wade would say it's a great example of how we as individuals understand the personal exception theory of gender, right? The personal exception theory of gender is the idea that I understand the gender binary, right? I understand the binary masculinity and femininity, and I can easily put other people into those categories. All men do this, and all women do that, and men like this, and women like that, right? But I also understand that I'm not all women, right? And that my own identity as a woman is much more nuanced and complicated than that. And so that's what the personal exception theory of gender is. And especially when you're young and you haven't really internalized your identity, you are often exploring that, right? You could be exploring, what type of job you want to do, your identity in terms of your gender, your sexuality. You're probably doing a lot of finding out who you are, right? And that's what she's doing. That's what Coco's doing. She says it's a conversation. It's a conversation with the queer community about her queer visibility. It's a conversation with the larger society. It's an exploration of her own individuality. And we're always doing that. It's always a conversation. We're always, how many negative sanctions are you willing to accept to assert a particular identity, right? And how are you going to find yourself within the culture from which you find yourself living, right? And a quote from the book says, projects like this point to the extensive work that goes into doing gender in a way that is recognizable by others. In other words, being culturally intelligible. You have to be culturally intelligible. That's the number one rule, right? So people are compelled to do this. So I tried to switch slides and I somehow stopped the video. I don't even know what I did. So what we were talking about, the number one gender rule, right? So the number one gender rule is that you have to, no matter what you do, whether you're following the rules, whether you're breaking the rules, you must be culturally intelligible. And if you're not, that recognition that you're doing gender, even when you're breaking the rules, what Butler calls performativity, you make people really uncomfortable because they don't know how to interact with you. Sometimes that's the point, right? But even when we break the rules, right, we're breaking the rules usually in such a way that people understand what we're doing. They understand we're breaking the rules to be part of a subgroup, or they understand that we're breaking the rules to provoke them, right? We're still doing gender in this culturally intelligible way, even when we're breaking the rules, right? If you refuse or you fail, it just leads to the type of social sanctions that oftentimes as individuals we're not able to deal with the consequences of, right? And kind of an example of how you can, like different groups through intersections of race and class and gender do gender differently was Mignon Moore's study on Black lesbian communities. And what her study did was show how extremely important doing gender in a way that was identifiable for queer communities or queer communities of color is to being recognized and to be belonging, right? I belong into this community. They foster a sense of place and belonging for me, right? And so while you might be breaking the dominant group's rules, you're breaking the dominant group's rules in such a way that foster an acceptance within this subordinate group, and that subordinate group creates a place of belonging and protection and community for you. And that's really, really important. Of course. Okay. Okay, so how and why do we follow or break the gender norms and rules, right? So performance itself of gender reinforces the belief that there's some form of authentic gendered self and it lies behind the performance, right? That's the folk theory that she's talking about. She's saying when we perform gender, especially when we perform it in a way that is culturally decipherable, we add to, even when we're breaking the rules, we add to the idea that it's somehow inherent and innate in totality, right? That it's not both your biology and a reflection of your society and your culture and your time and your place, how you perform the particular gender identity that you perform, right? And what makes people uncomfortable about what Coco does, like in War Paint, is that she's highlighting that that's a fiction, right? That there is no inevitable gendered self-programming, right? That we don't have to behave in a certain way because of the perception that that's the body that you inhabit and therefore that's who you are, or the sexuality that your identity proposes, and that somehow that shifts automatically your gendered presentation. So it sparks dialogue, but it sparks discomfort too, right? It makes us uncomfortable. It makes us talk about it. It challenges our investment in those folk theories about gender and sex, right? So how do we break those rules, and who gets to break those rules? Well, a lot of it has to do with all of us technically could, but who's more likely? Like, the wealthier you are, the higher class status you have, the more you're allowed to break rules, any rules, including gender norms, without any real social sanctions. But also, you can break rules when you offer an account, like there's a good reason why I'm breaking these rules in this particular way, because I'm part of a subculture. As a masculine male, I shave my legs because I play water polo, and water polo athletes shave their legs, right? So you're offering this type of account. And even War Paint is an account. She's offering an account. I'm exploring my gender identity and doing this art project. That is an account, right? But so if you think about it, how do individuals more commonly simultaneously break the rules and affirm the rules to explore their own gender identity? And how do you think people with a higher social status are policed differently? That's it for the lecture. It was a little discombobulated. Thank you for being here for the entire time if you made it all the way. And I hope you have a great day.